You ever hear New York go quiet? Not the kind of quiet where you can still hear a cab honking a few blocks away, or some drunk yelling from an alley. I mean real quiet, the kind that makes you check over your shoulder, 'cause something's off. That night, the city was holding its breath. And it wasn't for the mayor or some movie star. It was for a man most people didn't even know they were already working for, Charles Lucky Luciano. It was late, sometime after midnight, and the Lower East Side wore a thin coat of rain. The cobblestones glistened under the glow of crooked street lamps. Steam curled up from the manholes like the city was exhaling in slow, lazy puffs. A newsstand sat half-shuttered on the corner, yesterday's papers hanging limp in the drizzle, headlines about gang shootouts and prohibition raids already old news. Me, I was walking slow. Not 'cause I didn't have anywhere to be, but because I wanted to see who was still out. Nights like this, you can read the city. Every shadow, every glance, it all tells you something. From somewhere down the block, the faint notes of a trumpet bled out of a basement speakeasy, wrapping themselves around the rain like silk. Normally, that'd be my cue to head inside, have a drink, maybe see if the boys were playing cards in the back. But not tonight. Tonight, I was headed to a different table. One that didn't serve drinks, only decisions. You could hear the difference the second you stepped off the street and into Benny's backroom. Outside, the air was damp and cold. Inside, it was thick with smoke and the low murmur of voices you couldn't quite make out. A single bulb hung over the poker table, the light swaying just enough to make the shadows dance across the walls. 5 men sat around the table, but only one of them mattered, Lucky. He didn't look like much at first glance. Tailored suit, sure, but nothing loud. Hair slicked back, dark eyes that didn't wander much, he didn't need them to. The man could feel a room without looking at it. He was leaning back in his chair, one hand resting on a stack of chips, the other cradling a cigarette like it was worth more than gold. He wasn't playing the cards in front of him, he was playing the players. That was Lucky's thing. The game didn't matter, the people did. I watched him let Massimo take the pot, a guy known for running his mouth. Lucky gave him a smile that looked like friendship and felt like a warning. Then, when the next hand came, he leaned forward just a little, said something so quiet I couldn't hear it. Whatever it was, it froze Massimo mid-smirk. He folded without a fight. That's how Luciano worked, he didn't need to win every hand. Just the ones that counted. The rest of the room didn't know it yet, but they were sitting across from the future boss of bosses. This was the start, the quiet before the storm. You could almost taste it in the air. Outside, the rain picked up, drumming against the windows. Inside, Lucky lit another cigarette, the flare of the match catching in his eyes for a second before it was gone. He looked up, saw me standing there, and gave the smallest nod. That was all it took. When Lucky nodded, it meant you were in the room for a reason. I took a seat at the edge of the table, that felt cool under my hands. No one asked why I was there. In this business, questions get you killed. You learn to just listen. The talk shifted from cards to routes, from routes to shipments, from shipments to people who needed reminding about certain agreements. Nothing loud, nothing heated, just business. The kind of business that kept this city running, whether the politicians liked it or not. As the night wore on, I noticed something: every man here thought he was making deals with each other. But in reality, they were all making deals with Lucky. He never said so outright, he didn't have to. Every sentence, every pause, every sideways glance, it all pointed back to him. That's what made him dangerous. Not his muscle, not his trigger men. It was that brain. The man could take a city apart and put it back together without ever leaving his chair. At one point, the door creaked open and a kid in a wet cap stepped in, eyes darting nervously. He handed Lucky an envelope, then vanished before I even caught his name. Lucky didn't open it right away. He just rested it on the table, fingers tapping lightly on the paper as if to remind everyone that information was worth more than money. Finally, he slid it open, pulled out a folded sheet, read it once, twice, then tucked it back inside. He didn't say a word about it, not then. But whatever was in that letter, it shifted the whole air in the room. Deals slowed. Voices dropped. Something big was coming. When the meeting broke up, it wasn't loud. No one shook hands, no one laughed on their way out. They just slipped into the night like shadows fading into other shadows. Lucky was the last to leave, stepping into the rain without an umbrella, the smoke from his cigarette curling up into the lamplight. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He already owned the night. I stayed behind for a while, listening to the rain on the roof. That's when it hit me, New York hadn't gone quiet because it was scared. It had gone quiet because it was listening. Waiting. Waiting for a man who'd turn crime into a business, and business into an empire. That night was the first time I saw it for myself, the way a man could walk into a room full of gangsters and, without raising his voice, make every one of them play by his rules. And the thing about rules? They're only as strong as the man who writes them. They say every king starts as a pawn. Before he was Lucky Luciano, he was just Charlie, a skinny kid with sharp eyes and quicker hands, running the streets of the Lower East Side like it was his own personal chessboard. Back then, the streets didn't glitter, they groaned. Tenements packed so tight you could hear your neighbor breathing through the wall. The smell of coal smoke and frying onions clung to everything, your clothes, your skin, your dreams. Charlie was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, fresh off the boat from Sicily with his parents and siblings. They'd come chasing the same promise every immigrant family did: America, the land where anyone could make it. Only problem was, America had rules, and most of them weren't written for people like the Lucanias. From the very first winter, Charlie learned two things: the cold could kill you, and so could hunger. His old man, Antonio, worked the docks when he could get a shift, but there were more backs than jobs. His ma took in sewing, her fingers cracked and raw from the needle. The rent man still came on time even when the work didn't. Charlie's school was the street. You learned fast, or you didn't make it. He figured out early how to carry himself, chin up, eyes level, never flinch. Flinching marked you. And once you were marked, you were done. He ran with a little pack of kids, all teeth and elbows, dodging cops and stealing coal from delivery wagons. They'd sell it to old Mrs. Moretti for a few pennies and spend the coins on bread, or a slice of lemon ice in the summer. But Charlie wasn't just about scraping by. He had this itch, the kind that told him there was a bigger game out there, one with better prizes than a loaf of bread. He started charging other kids a nickel for protection on their way to school, which meant, of course, protection from him and his pals. It wasn't about the nickel. It was about control. Even as a boy, he understood something most grown men never figure out: power ain't just about what you have. It's about what other people think you have. Sunday afternoons were the only time the Lucania apartment felt like home. His ma would make pasta with whatever she could stretch, sometimes meatballs, more often just garlic and oil. The table was small, the room smaller, but for a couple of hours, the cold outside didn't matter. His father would tell stories about Sicily, about honor and family, about men who stood tall even when the world tried to push him down. Charlie soaked up every word, even if he didn't show it. Still, honor didn't pay the rent. By his early teens, Charlie was running errands for the older guys on the block, delivering packages, messages, sometimes a warning. He didn't ask what was in the packages. Didn't have to. One day, a man named Benny Catania, a neighborhood fixer with a soft voice and a hard stare, told Charlie, "Kid, you think fast. Don't waste it on nickel jobs. Stick with me, you'll be wearing silk before you're 20. Charlie didn't need silk. He needed a way out. Benny offered one. Under Benny's wing, Charlie learned the unspoken rules: never owe unless you have to, never promise unless you can deliver, and never, ever rat. He also learned the value of keeping friends in unexpected places. That's how he met Meyer Lansky, a short, quiet Jewish kid who could add faster in his head than most men could with a ledger. They met on the street during one of those half-serious, half-deadly gang scuffles between Italian and Jewish kids. While everyone else was swinging fists, Charlie noticed Meyer wasn't backing down, just watching, calculating. After that, they talked. Turns out Meyer had the same itch Charlie did. And if Charlie was the muscle and charm, Meyer was the brains and numbers. Together, they started thinking bigger. By the time Charlie hit 15, he'd already seen more violence than most men twice his age. Knife fights, beatings, cops looking the other way, it was all part of the neighborhood rhythm. But Charlie had a knack for avoiding the worst of it. Some said it was luck. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was just that he knew when to step forward and when to fade into the shadows. He wasn't perfect. Once, during a petty shakedown gone wrong, he took a bottle to the head. Woke up in an alley with blood crusted in his hair and his pockets turned out. That's when he decided, no more small-time mistakes. If he was gonna take a hit, it'd be for something worth bleeding for. The neighborhood had a way of pressing kids into molds. You were either a laborer, a nobody, or a crook. Charlie refused to be just one. He started dressing sharper, talking smoother, learning enough Yiddish to deal with the Jewish crews and enough Irish slang to get along with the Tammany Hall boys. Every handshake was a seed he planned to grow later. There was this one night down at the docks when Benny brought him to a meeting with some uptown fellas. The air smelled like salt and oil, and the moon threw silver on the black water. Charlie stayed quiet, listening as they talked about shipments, cops, and percentages. When they finally asked him what he thought, he didn't hesitate. "Everybody's fighting over the scraps," he said. "Why not split the pie before it's baked?" The men laughed at first, a kid talking business. But Benny just smiled. That was the first time Charlie saw respect in the eyes of men who could have had him tossed in the river. By 18, he was running small rackets of his own card games, bootleg deliveries, even some union persuasion work. He kept his circle tight, Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, a couple other guys who understood that the old rules were meant to be bent. The cops knew his name, but not well enough to make it stick. That's how Charlie liked it. Not too high to be a target, not too low to be forgotten. Looking back, you could see it, the makings of Lucky Luciano were already there in young Charlie from the block. The charm, the calculation, the patience to wait for the right moment. He wasn't the biggest, the toughest, or the loudest. But he was the one who could make all the pieces fit. And in a city where everyone was scrambling to stay one step ahead of hunger, Charlie was already thinking 5 steps ahead of everybody else. The Lower East Side didn't know it yet, but it was raising a man who'd changed the game forever. You don't get called lucky in New York without earning it, and Luciano earned it the hard way. It happened in '29, but to understand that night, you gotta know the kind of city we were living in. Prohibition wasn't just about booze, it was about power. The Volstead Act turned every bottle into gold and every man with a truck into a king, if he could keep the cops, the hijackers, and the competition off his back. By then, Charlie wasn't just running nickel jobs. He was knee-deep in the bootlegging game, moving shipments from the docks to the speakeasies, greasing the right palms, and cutting deals with the Irish crews uptown. He'd teamed up tight with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, the three of them carving out a network that didn't care about old ethnic lines. Business was business, and money didn't care what language you spoke. But money also had a smell, and that smell drew trouble. One night, Charlie was making his usual rounds when a black sedan rolled up slow beside him. No words, no warning. Just a car door opening and a couple of guys telling him to get in. Now, most people in this town knew that when somebody told you to get in, you either didn't or you never got out. Charlie? He got in. They drove him out past the lights of the city, into the marshland where the air was damp and cold. No one said much. He could see their eyes in the rear view, flat, unreadable. He knew the rules. If they were gonna kill him, there was nothing to do but keep your mouth shut and your head up. When they finally stopped, they dragged him out, and that's when the beating started. Fists, boots, even a couple of knife slashes. He went down, came up, went down again. The mud was in his mouth, the salt of blood in his teeth. They left him there in the dark, thinking they'd finished the job. But Charlie didn't stay down. Bruised, cut, ribs aching with every breath, he staggered his way back to the road and caught the last ride he'd ever take for free. By morning, the word was already spreading. He'd been kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, and he walked away from it. That's when they started calling him Lucky. The name stuck, but it wasn't luck that kept him alive. It was the same thing that had been keeping him alive since he was a kid. He knew when to talk, when to listen, and when to disappear. After that, people started looking at him differently. You could see it in the way the old bosses sized him up. The Sicilian mustache Petes, the old school guys who believed in keeping everything in the family, saw him as a wild card. The younger, hungrier crowd saw him as the guy who might just pull off what nobody else could, uniting the streets without drowning them in blood. It wasn't all street fights and alleyway deals. Lucky was building something bigger and cleaner. He was making connections with politicians, cops, and businessmen who liked the idea of steady money more than messy wars. Meyer would run the numbers. Bugsy would handle the heavy lifting when persuasion didn't work. And Lucky? He was the face, the handshake, the man who could walk into a room full of enemies and leave with their cooperation, or at least their silence. But the city was still a powder keg. Bootlegging was big money, and big money drew big egos. The Irish wanted more territory. The Jewish crews wanted better routes. The Italians couldn't even agree among themselves. Every week, there was another shooting, another headline, another mother crying in the street. Lucky knew it couldn't last. You can't do business in a war zone. So he started thinking long-term. He made trips upstate to meet with suppliers, trips down to Atlantic City to talk shop with other outfits. These meetings weren't about tonight's shipment or tomorrow's job. They were about what the mob could look like in 5, 10 years, organized, structured, less about blood feuds and more about profits. One of the first big moves under his belt was smoothing things out between rival bootlegging crews after a messy hijacking. Instead of letting it spiral into another street war, Lucky called both sides into a backroom at a club in Little Italy. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and suspicion. He let them vent, let them threaten each other. Then he leaned in and said, "You keep killing each other over barrels, and the feds will thank you for making their job easy. You cut me in, I cut you in. We all walk out richer." It worked. Not perfectly, but enough. Around this time, he started appearing at better tables, not the cramped poker rooms of the Lower East Side, but restaurants uptown where the silverware didn't bend and the wine didn't come in a jug. He'd sit with union bosses, Broadway producers, even a couple of city councilmen who were more interested in envelopes than laws. Lucky knew appearances mattered. If you looked like a businessman, people treated you like one even if your business ran on rackets and protection money. But beneath the polished suits and quiet dinners, the streets were still simmering. Joe the Boss Masuria ran the show for the Italians, and he liked things the old way, power through fear, loyalty through blood. That worked fine until Salvatore Maranzano came from Brooklyn, preaching the same Sicilian tradition but with his own crown in mind. The two were headed for a collision. And in the middle of that road was Lucky. By now, the name Lucky Luciano meant something. It meant you could survive a hit and still show up to dinner looking like you owned the place. It meant you could talk to Irish mobsters, Jewish fixers, and Italian dons without starting a fight. But it also meant people were watching you, weighing you, wondering when you'd make your move. And make no mistake, Lucky was waiting. Not for luck. Not for a break. For the right moment. The kind of moment that could turn a survivor into a king. Wars don't always start with bullets. In this city, they start with whispers. A name here, a warning there. Somebody's cousin sees somebody's crew in the wrong part of town, and pretty soon the air smells like blood even before the first shot's fired. In 29, the whispers turned into something else. Something bigger. The Castellamarese War. It was a fight for the soul and the spoils of the Italian mob in New York. On one side, Joe the Boss Masuria, running things like it was still the old country, loyalty to the man above you, suspicion of anyone who wasn't Sicilian, and a love for brute force when subtlety would have done. On the other side, Salvatore Maranzano, fresh from Brooklyn by way of Castellamare del Golfo in Sicily, carrying himself like a Roman emperor and talking about cleaning up the streets, which, in mob language, meant putting himself in charge. From the outside, it might have looked like just another gang beef. But inside the game, everybody knew this wasn't small time. This was an all-out struggle for control, for who got to decide the rules and who had to live by them. And there in the middle, like a man watching two dogs fight over the same bone, was Lucky Luciano. Lucky had been with Masuria's camp for a while. The boss liked him, saw him as a useful young buck who could handle business without getting squeamish. But Lucky wasn't blind. He knew Masuria's way of doing things was old, clumsy, bleeding money in the streets. Maranzano, on the other hand, was slicker, but he was still chained to the Sicilian tradition that shut out every valuable player who wasn't born on the island. In Lucky's eyes, both men were relics. The future was gonna look different, and he was already thinking about who'd be in that picture. The war kicked off with small hits: a driver found slumped over the wheel, a bagman disappearing between one block and the next. Then it escalated. Masuria's men ambushed Maranzano's in the Bronx, leaving 3 bodies cooling in the gutter. The next week, Maranzano's boys returned the favor in Little Italy, the smell of cordite hanging in the air long after the cops had come and gone. The papers ate it up. Gangland war erupts splashed across front pages, reporters counting bodies like box scores. For guys like me, it was bad for business. Too many headlines meant too much heat: raids, arrests, nervous politicians pretending they didn't know who we were. But for the bosses, it was about pride. Neither side wanted to blink first. Lucky kept his head low, moving between camps under the excuse of making peace. But what he was really doing was taking notes. Who was loyal? Who was greedy? Who could be bought? Who couldn't be trusted? In a war like this, information was worth more than bullets. One winter night, I was with him when we met Lansky in a back booth of a diner in Midtown. Outside, the snow was coming down in thick, wet flakes, making the city feel smaller, quieter. "You can't run a business when your suppliers are getting shot in the street," Lansky said, stirring his coffee. "We end this thing, we end it on our terms." Lucky didn't answer right away. He just took a drag off his cigarette, blew the smoke toward the frosted window. "Masuria's too stubborn," he said finally. "Maranzano's too ambitious. They're gonna kill each other with or without us." But when the dust settles, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. We all knew who he meant would be standing. In the months that followed, the killings got bolder: bombs under cars, gunfights in daylight. Maranzano's men hit a Masuria crew in a Brooklyn bakery, flour dust mixing with blood on the tiles. Masuria's people torched a warehouse they thought belonged to Maranzano, turned out it didn't. Collateral damage. The cops rounded up a few small-timers, but the big fish kept swimming. Lucky kept up appearances with Masuria, smiling, shaking hands, delivering envelopes. But behind the scenes, he was laying groundwork with Maranzano. Not promises, not yet. Just conversations. "You ever think about how much money we're leaving on the table?" Lucky would say. "All this killing, all this heat. We could be running the whole city if we worked smart." Maranzano would nod, but there was a gleam in his eye that said he wasn't thinking about sharing. That was the thing about Lucky, he never played just one angle. While he was talking sweet to Maranzano, he was keeping Masuria calm, feeding him enough good news to keep him from suspecting just how thin his ice was getting. It was a dangerous dance. One wrong word to the wrong man, and you'd end up face down in the East River. There was one night late in the war when Lucky got a warning. We were at a club in Harlem, the music jumping, the gin flowing, when a kid I didn't know slipped him a folded piece of paper. He read it, didn't say a word, just slipped it into his pocket. Later, in the car, he pulled it out and handed it to me. It was one line: "They're gonna test your loyalty soon." We didn't know which side it came from. Didn't matter. Both sides were dangerous, and both sides were watching. Spring came, but the war didn't thaw. By then, the city was tired, the civilians, the cops, even some of the soldiers in the street. Too many funerals, too much blood on the sidewalks. Lucky knew it was time to end it. But ending it meant picking a side and then making sure that side didn't last long enough to box him in. The last months of the Castellammarise war weren't about bullets anymore. They were about positioning. Lucky started keeping his crew tight, moving them like chess pieces. A sit down here, a handshake there, a promise whispered over a glass of rye. All the while, the bosses thought they were leading him into battle. In reality, he was leading them toward the finish line and the trap that waited just past it. By the summer of '31, both camps were running on fumes. Men were exhausted, businesses were bleeding, and even the bosses were feeling the heat from the papers and the law. That's when Lucky made his move. It wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. Not yet. Just a quiet agreement with himself: this war would end, and when it did, neither Masuria nor Maranzano would be the last man standing. And the next move? That would be the one that put his name in the history books, for better or worse. In the life, betrayal doesn't come with a warning label. It comes with a smile. A handshake. A promise over dinner. By the spring of 1931, Lucky had been walking a razor's edge for months, keeping Masuria calm, keeping Maranzano curious, and keeping himself alive in a city where both bosses had a habit of making problems disappear. But you can only play both sides for so long before somebody demands proof of loyalty. For Lucky, that proof came in the form of an unspoken choice: stick with Masuria and fade into the past with him, or bet it all on a future that didn't include Joe the boss. Masuria was slipping. He didn't see it, of course, bosses rarely do. He still strutted through his gambling rooms like a king, still collected envelopes like the city owed him tribute. But the war had drained him. His soldiers were tired, his cash flow thin, and too many of his allies had vanished into shallow graves. The smart ones saw the writing on the wall and started keeping their distance. The problem was, Masuria still thought loyalty was a one-way street. If you were with him once, you were with him forever. Lucky knew better. It started, as these things often do, with a quiet conversation in a quiet place. One night, in a dim apartment above a candy store in Little Italy, Lucky met with Maranzano. No bodyguards. No fanfare. Just two men, a bottle of Marsala wine, and a chessboard between them. "You're a smart man, Sal," Lucky said, moving upon forward. "But smart men still bleed in this city. I don't want to see that happen to you." Maranzano smiled thinly. "And what about your boss? You don't want to see that happen to him?" Lucky shrugged, eyes on the board. Joe's had his time. Now the city needs something different. Something organized. Maranzano didn't press. He didn't have to. In that room, over that chessboard, the understanding was sealed. Masuria would go, and Lucky would be the one to make it happen. Arranging the betrayal wasn't simple. Masuria was cautious by habit, especially now that the war had taken so many of his friends. But he had one weakness: he trusted Lucky. Saw him as the son he never had. That trust was the key, and Lucky knew exactly how to use it. The plan was simple on paper, dangerous in execution: get Masuria somewhere quiet, somewhere safe in his mind, then step away long enough for Maranzano's gunman to walk in. April 15, 1931. It was a Monday. Not that the day of the week mattered much in our business, but Lucky would later say he picked it for a reason. Monday was slow. Less foot traffic. Less chance of the wrong eye seeing the wrong thing. They met at Nuova Villa tomorrow, a little Italian restaurant in Coney Island. The kind of place with checkered tablecloths, soft music, and a back room where you could talk business without the hum of the main dining area creeping in. Lucky arrived first, made sure the room was set just right, cards on the table, a couple of bottles of wine breathing. Then Masuria came in, all smiles, shaking hands with the staff like a man who believed he owned the place. They played cards for a while. Talked about the weather, the horses, a shipment that had come in from Havana. Lucky kept the mood light, like nothing in the world was wrong. At one point, he excused himself, said he needed to take a call. Stepped out into the hallway, lit a cigarette. And waited. Inside, Masuria kept playing, the soft clink of chips marking the seconds. Outside, footsteps moved fast up the narrow corridor. 3 men. No words. A door opened, and in less than half a minute, it was over. Masuria slumped in his chair, card still in hand, blood pooling on the green felt. 4 bullet holes in his chest, 2 in his head. Just like that, Joe the boss was no more. Lucky didn't go back in. He didn't need to see it. He just walked out the front, got in a waiting car, and didn't look over his shoulder. The papers would call it a brazen mob hit. The cops would pretend to investigate. But on the street, everybody knew what it meant. The Castellamarese War was over. And Lucky Luciano had picked the winning side. But winning the war didn't mean safety. In fact, it was the opposite. Now that Maranzano was in charge, the city braced for a new kind of rule. He called himself Capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, and he liked the sound of it so much he started carrying himself like Julius Caesar. He reorganized the families, handed out titles, demanded tributes. And in every meeting, he reminded people that he had ended the war. Lucky smiled through it. But inside, he was already thinking, one boss is just another problem. That's the thing about betrayal, once you've done it, the line gets easier to cross the next time. Masuria had been the first. Maranzano would be the second. And by the time the next betrayal came, Lucky wouldn't be sharing power with anybody. For now, though, he played the loyal lieutenant, attending Maranzano's dinners, nodding in the right places, making the new boss feel like the city was his. All the while, he kept building his own network, guys who owed him, not Maranzano. Guys who understood that the future of organized crime wasn't about bloodlines or birthplace. It was about business. And if business meant cutting down another boss, Lucky was already sharpening the knife. In the summer of 1931, New York smelled different. The gunpowder haze of the Castellamarese War had finally lifted. For the first time in years, the city's gangsters could walk the streets without wondering if the next corner would bring a carload of enemies with Thompson guns. But peace, as Lucky Luciano saw it, wasn't just the absence of bullets. It was the presence of order. Maranzano thought he'd brought that order when he crowned himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. He strutted through meetings like a Roman emperor, assigning provinces to his loyal captains, inspecting their books, demanding tribute like the old Sicilian padrinos. It might have worked in the mountains of Palermo, but in New York? It was already an antique. Lucky played along. He smiled at Maranzano's speeches, nodded when he spoke of tradition and honor. But behind those polite expressions, his mind was building something entirely different, a structure with no single throne to fight over. A system that could survive even if its biggest names fell. A thing the old world bosses would never have imagined, a commission. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of one boss ruling all, the city's 5 major families would sit as equals at a round table. Disputes would be settled by vote, not bloodshed. Territory would be divided by agreement, not ambush. And, most importantly, any boss who thought himself untouchable would find out otherwise, without the whole city being dragged into war. Of course, for that plan to work, Maranzano had to go. And not just because of his ego. Word started circulating that he'd been meeting with hand-picked killers, whispering about removing young Turks like Luciano and Genovese before they got too ambitious. It was a fatal mistake. September 10, 1931. Lucky made his move. He didn't send soldiers with machine guns. That would have been too obvious, too noisy. Instead, he used a touch of theater. 4 men arrived at Maranzano's office on Park Avenue. They were dressed like federal agents, suits, badges, the whole act. They claimed they needed to see the boss about an urgent matter. Inside, they dropped the pretense. Knives first, then bullets. The self-proclaimed boss of all bosses never saw the real play coming. With Maranzano gone, the old Sicilian hierarchy crumbled overnight. The commission was born. The inaugural members read like the credits of a gangster epic: Charlie Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Joe Prophesy, Tommy Gagliano, Vincent Mangano, and Chicago's own Al Capone, who sent representatives from his Cook County empire. Luciano didn't just hand out seats, he handed out a vision. No more wars, he told them. We run this like a business. Businessmen don't shoot each other in the street. They sit down. They make deals. They make money. It was a hard sell for some. Old grudges die slow. But the bodies of Masuria and Maranzano were still fresh reminders that the old ways ended in a pine box. And the money, well, the money was convincing. Under Luciano's system, gambling dens, bootlegging operations, and union rackets ran smoother than ever. Profits soared. Even the politicians who once pretended to fight organized crime started seeing the benefits of a quieter, more predictable underworld. Behind the scenes, Lucky also made changes the papers never printed. He insisted on a separation between the bosses and the street crews. That way, if the cops picked up a low-level soldier, they couldn't trace the chain all the way to the top. He diversified rackets, drugs, construction kickbacks, shipping, unions. If one stream dried up, 10 more kept flowing. He even ordered the syndicate to invest in legitimate businesses: laundries, bakeries, even theaters. Places where dirty money could be washed clean. In a way, Lucky was less a gangster now than a CEO. But he never forgot the streets. He kept his ties close, showed up at weddings, christenings, funerals. He understood that respect wasn't earned in boardrooms alone. It was built on trust, fear, and the quiet understanding that he could still be dangerous when needed. The city noticed. By 1934, crime reporters were writing about the American Mafia like it was a shadow government. They weren't wrong. Luciano's commission had more influence than City Hall. Decisions made in backrooms on Mulberry Street rippled out to Chicago, Detroit, even Havana. And yet, for all his success, Lucky knew it couldn't last forever. The more powerful you became, the bigger a target you painted on your back. The cops were watching. The feds were listening. And somewhere, in some smoky backroom, another ambitious young man was already imagining a world without Lucky Luciano. But for the moment, in the mid-1930s, New York belonged to him. The bullets had stopped. The money was flowing. And the rise of a new order, his order. By 1935, Lucky Luciano was at the peak of his empire. The commission was running like clockwork, profits were higher than ever, and politicians who once swore to clean up the streets now quietly took envelopes under restaurant tables. But in the shadows, a storm was gathering, and it had a name: Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was no street cop. He was the Manhattan special prosecutor, a clean-cut, iron-willed lawyer who didn't take bribes, didn't take favors, and didn't scare easily. Where other prosecutors had failed, Dewey came armed with a new strategy. Instead of chasing bootleggers or mob hits, he went after the one business Luciano thought untouchable: prostitution. For decades, New York's sex trade had been scattered, chaotic, and impossible to control. Luciano had changed that. He turned brothels into a centralized, union-like operation: fixed prices, set hours, and strict rules. It was profitable, predictable, and easy to trace once someone started pulling on the right threads. That someone was a woman named Mildred the Countess Harris, a former madam who knew how the network worked from the inside. When Dewey's men arrested her, she didn't hold out for long. In exchange for protection, she talked. And she didn't just name street-level pimps. She connected the whole chain up to the top, to Lucky Luciano himself. The case built fast. Raids swept through brothels in Midtown and the Bronx. Girls and madams facing charges of their own started flipping, each one adding another piece to Dewey's puzzle. By spring of 1936, Dewey had over 60 witnesses ready to testify. It didn't matter that Luciano rarely set foot in those brothels himself. In the eyes of the law, if he controlled the business, he was guilty. On April 1, 1936, the headline screamed, "Luciano indicted in vice ring." Lucky was in Hot Springs, Arkansas, supposedly for business meetings and a little gambling. Dewey sent word to the Arkansas police. Luciano was arrested at the Park Hotel. No shootout, no dramatic getaway, just a pair of handcuffs and a long trip back to New York under heavy guard. The trial was pure theater. Dewey painted Luciano as the cold mastermind of a vast exploitation racket, the man who turned human vice into corporate profit. Luciano's defense team argued he was being framed, that Dewey was just chasing headlines. But the witnesses, one after another, told the same story: how money was collected, where it went, who gave the orders. The jurors took less than a day to decide. On June 18, 1936, Charles Lucky Luciano was found guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison. For a man who had controlled New York's underworld, the fall was absolute. The same week, newspapers ran photographs of him in handcuffs, his tailored suits replaced by prison denim. His empire didn't collapse overnight. The commission-insured business kept going, but without Lucky at the table, others began filling the vacuum. Frank Costello took over many of his operations. Vito Genovese, ever the opportunist, positioned himself for the future. In Dannemora prison, far from the neon glow of Manhattan, Luciano adjusted to a new reality. He kept his mind sharp, read newspapers daily, and stayed connected to the outside world through visitors and coded letters. But deep down, he knew the odds of walking free anytime soon were slim. Then came the war. By 1942, World War II was in full swing, and America's East Coast was under threat from German U-boats. The U.S. Navy worried about sabotage in New York's docks, and they knew the mob controlled the waterfront. Enter Operation Underworld. Through a series of back-channel talks, naval intelligence struck a deal. Luciano would use his influence to keep the docks safe from spies and strikes. In return, there would be considerations about his sentence after the war. It was a gamble, but one Lucky played well. The docks stayed secure. No sabotage, no strikes. And when the war ended, the promise was kept, sort of. In 1946, Governor Thomas E. Dewey, the same man who put him away, commuted Luciano's sentence. But there was a catch: freedom came with deportation. Luciano, an Italian citizen despite decades in America, was put on a ship and sent to Naples. He would never set foot in the United States again. For the newspapers, it was the end of an era. For Luciano, it was something else, not quite the end, not quite a beginning. From exile, he would find new ways to pull strings, build alliances, and keep his name alive in the game he had once ruled. But the New York throne was gone, and with it, the control he had fought, bled, and schemed for. From kingpin to convict, from the top of the world to a man without a country, the rise of a new order had ended, and the fall from the top was complete. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the U.S. Navy ship in Naples in 1946, he was technically a free man, but also in exile. He had no real home here. Italy was war-scarred, rationing food, and crawling with both Allied troops and black market hustlers. Luciano's clothes were sharp, but the streets were not his kingdom anymore. His true empire was 3,000 miles away, in New York. Still, Lucky was nothing if not adaptable. From a modest apartment in Naples, he began to rebuild his network. Letters and coded cables went out to his old associates. Trusted couriers carried messages between Italy, New York, and other hotspots in Europe. And as the post-war world shifted, a new opportunity appeared on the map, one with sunshine, cigars, and no extradition treaty. Cuba. Cuba in the late 1940s was paradise for anyone in Luciano's line of work. Havana's casinos ran all night. Nightclubs pulsed with rumba and jazz. Politicians were bought and sold as easily as a hand of cards. The local government, under President Ramon Grau and later Fulgencio Batista, was happy to let American mobsters invest in the booming tourist economy as long as the cash kept flowing. For Luciano, it was perfect. He could be close to the U.S., meet with associates face-to-face, and still stay out of reach of American law. By 1946, he was arranging to settle in Havana. He wasn't alone. Meyer Lansky, his longtime ally and financial genius, had already planted deep roots there, building a network of casino and hotel interests. And so came the Havana Conference of 1946, one of the most legendary gatherings in mob history. Picture the scene, the Nacional Hotel, its grand white facade glowing in the Caribbean sun. Limousines pulling up to the entrance. Inside, the lobby filled with the most powerful mob bosses in America: Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, and dozens more. They arrived not just for business, but for the kind of power summit that would decide the shape of organized crime for the next decade. Luciano was the unofficial host. Though technically deported and barred from the U.S., he was still treated like the top man, the architect of the commission, the one who had modernized the mob. The agenda was heavy: expansion of heroin trafficking routes from Europe through Cuba to the United States. Coordination of casino investments across Havana. Dispute resolutions between rival factions in New York, Chicago, and Tampa. A very sensitive question: what to do about Benjamin Bugsy Siegel and the troubled Flamingo Hotel project in Las Vegas. For days, the mob's elite discussed strategy in private suites, smoked endless cigars, and tested the casino tables downstairs. Luciano's words still carried weight, but he noticed something unsettling: some of the younger bosses looked to Genovese and Lansky as much as to him. Exile had weakened his hands on the strings. Still, the Havana Conference ended on a high note for Lucky. He had reasserted himself, secured alliances, and positioned Cuba as the new gateway for international operations. But the celebration wouldn't last long. Word of Luciano's presence in Havana reached Washington. The U.S. government wasn't pleased that the man they'd deported was now orchestrating mob strategy just 90 miles from Florida. They pressured Cuban officials, warning of economic consequences if Luciano wasn't removed. The breaking point came in early 1947 when newspapers splashed photographs of Luciano at the Nacional, mingling openly with America's most wanted gangsters. The Cuban government caved. One morning, police arrived at his door, politely informing him that his residency permit was revoked. He was put on a plane back to Italy, no arguments allowed. Once again, Lucky was in Naples, staring at a Mediterranean coastline that felt more like a prison wall than a view. Havana had been his last chance to stand in the same room as the rulers of the American underworld. Now he would have to pull strings from even farther away, and every year, those strings frayed. Still, the Havana Conference had left its mark. Decisions made there shaped the mob's involvement in Las Vegas, tightened control over narcotics pipelines, and solidified the role of Cuba in organized crime, at least until Castro's revolution a decade later. For Luciano, though, exile was no longer temporary. The king was still alive, but the throne was gone. And every move from here on would be a game played from the shadows. By the 1950s, Lucky Luciano was still a name whispered with respect, but no longer with fear. The American mob had evolved. New bosses were making their fortunes in Las Vegas, Miami, and Chicago without ever needing to consult the man who'd once run it all. From Naples, Luciano could only watch through letters, phone calls, and carefully trusted intermediaries. Still, he wasn't entirely powerless. He kept ties to old allies, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and a handful of loyal soldiers. And through the heroin trade, Luciano remained a silent partner in a pipeline that stretched from the poppy fields of Turkey to the streets of Harlem. Naples, with its bustling port, was an ideal midpoint for smuggling operations. Even in semi-retirement, he knew how to turn geography into profit. But the years were catching up. Luciano was in his early 60s now, his once lean frame thickened, his hair grayer. The sharp suits remained, but there was a stiffness in his movements. The cigarettes were constant, the whiskey measured a man pacing himself for a long endgame. And behind the calm exterior was something new, paranoia. He had reason for it. Vito Genovese, his old rival, now had significant influence in New York. Genovese never forgave Luciano for outmaneuvering him decades earlier, and Luciano knew the feeling was mutual. In the underworld, grudges didn't die of old age. Then there were the cops. The U.S. Narcotics Bureau had not forgotten him, and neither had the Italian authorities. Every so often, he'd notice a man lingering across the street too long, or a stranger sitting in a cafe 2 tables over. Luciano had built a life on reading the room, and now the room always felt slightly dangerous. Still, he kept working. And then, in 1962, came an unexpected opportunity, one that would prove to be his last big move. A Hollywood producer named Martin Gosch approached Luciano with an offer to make a film based on his life story. Not a police exposé, not a hatchet job, but a dramatized biography told from Luciano's own perspective. Gosch promised creative control and a respectful portrayal. For a man who had shaped his own legend for decades, the chance to cement it on film was irresistible. Over the next few years, Luciano and Gosch met repeatedly. They talked for hours about the old days, the 5 Points, the Commission, Havana. Luciano was careful about what he revealed, blending truth with myth. Even in semi-retirement, he knew the value of a good story, and he wasn't about to give away his real secrets for free. By 1962, the outlines of the deal were taking shape. Gosch planned to bring in American financing and shoot in Europe. Luciano would consult on every scene. There was money in it, yes, but more importantly, there was immortality. The streets might forget, but film could last forever. Then, on January 26, 1962, it all came to an abrupt end. The day began normally enough. Luciano was in Naples, dressed impeccably as always. He had an appointment at the Capodichino airport to meet with Gosch and finalize details for the film project. Witnesses later said he seemed in good spirits, smiling, shaking hands, talking about the big picture. What happened next is part of the mystery. Accounts vary. Some say Luciano was waiting outside the airport when he suddenly collapsed. Others claim he had just greeted Gosch when his face went pale and he fell to the ground. Officially, the cause was a heart attack. He was 64 years old. But in the underworld, nothing is ever just official. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that he'd been poisoned, perhaps by rivals who feared the movie would reveal too much. Others suggested government agents had wanted to silence him before he could make headlines again. And some believed it was simply fate, a lifetime of tension, cigarettes, and quiet wars catching up with him all at once. Whatever the truth, Luciano's death marked the end of an era. The man who had transformed organized crime into a corporation had died not in a gunfight, not in prison, but standing on an airport curb, waiting for a ride. In its own way, it was the perfect exit for a man who'd spent his life in motion. His funeral in Naples was a strange affair, part underworld tribute, part state curiosity. Gangsters, politicians, businessmen, and police all showed up, each with their own reasons. Some came to pay respects, others to make sure he was really gone. The casket, draped in flowers, seemed too small for a man whose shadow had once stretched from Sicily to Chicago. In the years that followed, Luciano's legend only grew. Some called him a visionary, others, a ruthless opportunist. But all agreed on one thing: he had changed the game forever. Before Luciano, the Mafia had been a loose collection of gangs bound by tradition and vendetta. After Luciano, it was an empire, structured, disciplined, and global. Standing at his graveside, one old associate reportedly muttered, "The boss is gone, but his rules still run the streets. And in a way, they did. The commission he built remained the governing body of the American mob for decades. The alliances he forged survived revolutions, wars, and FBI crackdowns. Even from the grave, Lucky Luciano's blueprint for organized crime endured. In the end, his story was not just about crime, it was about power, adaptation, and the careful balance between visibility and control. Luciano had walked that line longer than most, and though exile took away his throne, it never took away his crown. When Lucky Luciano's coffin was lowered into the earth in 1962, it wasn't just a man being buried, it was the blueprint of modern organized crime. The newspapers printed the usual obituaries: Mafia boss dead, Luciano dies of heart attack in Naples. But for those who understood the streets, it was the end of a particular kind of rule, one built on order, discretion, and long-term vision. In the decades that followed, his name would slip into a strange place between history and fiction. On one side were law enforcement files, court transcripts, and carefully archived FBI reports. On the other were novels, films, and whispered barroom stories, half-true tales that grew larger with every retelling. The biggest transformation of his image came in the 1970s with the release of The Godfather. Francis Ford Coppola's sweeping mafia epic drew on real figures for inspiration, and while Vito Corleone was loosely based on several mob bosses, Luciano's influence was undeniable. The calm intelligence, the strategic mind, the ability to unite warring factions, these were Luciano trademarks. But there was a twist. In The Godfather, loyalty was romanticized, family bonds idealized. Luciano's real world had been far colder. He respected loyalty but never mistook it for permanence. In his mind, alliances were transactions, family was often just a liability. The movie softened those truths into something audiences could root for. This blending of fact and fiction reshaped his public image. Younger generations who never read the trial transcripts or the exile orders began to imagine him as the archetypal honorable mobster, a man who killed only when necessary, who protected his people, who had a personal code. The truth was murkier. Luciano had rules, yes, but they were about efficiency, not morality. Violence was avoided when business could solve the problem, but when it couldn't, he didn't hesitate. Still, in the cultural imagination, the myth stuck. Books and documentaries painted him as the criminal genius who had brought the mafia into the modern age, a kind of underworld CEO. And in many ways, that was accurate. His creation of the commission was the most significant structural reform in mob history, giving rival families a way to settle disputes without endless bloodshed. That system endured for decades after his death, and pieces of it still survive today. In Italy, his name remained charged. For some, he was a folk hero, the Sicilian who had outsmarted both American gangsters and their police. For others, he was a traitor, the man who had helped U.S. forces invade Sicily in 1943 during World War II in exchange for leniency. That alleged deal, Operation Underworld, became one of the most persistent stories in Luciano lore. The U.S. Navy always denied it outright. But the fact that the ports of New York suddenly became free of sabotage during the war, and that Luciano's prison sentence was suddenly commuted afterward, kept the rumor alive. Over time, Luciano's image became a template. When new mob movies or TV shows appeared, critics and fans would trace their characters back to him. Tony Soprano? The strategic patience of Luciano. Michael Corleone's transition from outsider to leader? Luciano's real-life arc. Even fictional drug lords in non-Italian settings borrowed pieces of his style, the combination of charm, intimidation, and long-term thinking. Ironically, while pop culture elevated him to almost mythical status, the real mafia was changing in ways he might not have approved. By the 1980s and 1990s, the rise of the drug trade had exploded into violence he had always tried to contain. The commission structure began to collapse under FBI pressure and internal betrayals. The idea of keeping a low profile, a Luciano specialty, gave way to flashy displays of wealth and open feuds. The quiet diplomacy he had championed was replaced by headline-making shootouts. In this way, Luciano's legacy became two different things: in fiction, the calm, strategic godfather who blended business with loyalty. In reality, the ruthless, calculating architect of a criminal system who valued results over sentiment. And yet, there was one part of the myth that even the most skeptical historians couldn't deny: Luciano had vision. He saw that crime could be organized, regulated, and, in its own twisted way, civilized. He saw that rules could limit unnecessary chaos and that unity could create power far greater than endless street wars. In Naples, where he spent his final years, the locals still tell stories. There's the cafe where he used to sit for hours, reading the Italian papers. The tailor who swore Luciano never repeated a suit pattern. The port workers who claimed they could feel when the boss was nearby even if they'd never met him. In New York, his legend lives in different ways: in the back rooms of old Italian restaurants, in the graffiti tags in Little Italy, in the names dropped by aging wise guys trying to lend weight to their own stories. And in Hollywood, his spirit still lingers in every new iteration of the mobster archetype. The sharp-dressed boss who speaks softly but controls an empire, that's Luciano's gift to pop culture. The details may change, the accents may shift, but the blueprint remains. Even today, historians debate how much of his life was real and how much was self-crafted legend. But maybe that's the point. Luciano understood that perception was power. If people saw him as untouchable, strategic, and inevitable, then, for all practical purposes, he was. In the end, Lucky Luciano left behind no children, no memoirs in his own hand, no taped confessions. What he left instead was something more durable: a framework for power, and a story that refuses to die. Whether you see him as a visionary, a villain, or a mix of both, one truth remains: the world he built still casts a shadow. In the final measure of history, Charles Lucky Luciano stands as one of the most paradoxical figures of the 20th century, a man who was both a product of his time and an architect of its underworld future. His story begins in the poverty-soaked streets of New York's Lower East Side, where survival demanded cunning, fearlessness, and an instinct for opportunity. It ends in exile on the sunlit shores of Naples, far from the empire he had built, yet never truly cut off from its echoes. Luciano's legacy cannot be summed up with a single label: not criminal, not visionary, not even godfather. He was all of these and none of them, a figure whose actions rewrote the rules of organized crime while also ensuring his name would live far beyond his lifetime. His was a career defined by contradictions: the ruthless killer who preferred diplomacy, the uneducated immigrant who became an international power broker, the man who could inspire loyalty even among rivals trained to trust no one. Perhaps his greatest achievement was recognizing that chaos was bad for business. Before Luciano, the Mafia in America was a fractured network of families locked in constant, bloody turf wars. After Luciano, it became a unified, if fragile, confederation governed by rules, meetings, and mediation. The Commission, his crowning creation, was part parliament, part cartel, and it allowed for an unprecedented period of stability in the underworld. For decades, that structure endured, even as law enforcement grew more aggressive and technology made secrecy harder. But his genius carried a price. By making organized crime more efficient, Luciano also made it far more resilient. What he built would survive long after his death, mutating to fit new markets: drugs, gambling, labor racketeering, corporate fraud. In some ways, his influence outlasted even the cultural forces that had shaped him. Today, the name Lucky Luciano still carries weight. In academic circles, he's studied as a case in leadership, strategy, and organizational innovation, albeit in an illegal arena. In pop culture, he's immortalized as the archetypal mob boss, his image distilled into countless film and television characters. To the public, he exists somewhere between truth and myth, a man as carefully crafted as the Hollywood stories he inspired. And maybe that was his final silent victory: control over his own narrative. Luciano understood that, in the end, perception could be as powerful as bullets. If people believed he was untouchable, then he was. If they believed he was a man of vision, then history would remember him that way. He didn't just play the game, he reshaped it, then made sure the story was told on his terms. As the credits of his life rolled in 1962, the world he left behind was already shifting. Law enforcement was getting sharper, technology more intrusive, and the next generation of mobsters less disciplined. The era of quiet diplomacy was giving way to one of spectacle and violence. But for all their bluster, those who came after him could never quite match the elegance of Luciano's reign. His blueprint still lingers, in whispers, in old photographs, in the structure of syndicates that refuse to die. Even the FBI's most detailed reports can't fully untangle where the man ended and the myth began. In the end, Luciano's story is not just the chronicle of a gangster, but a mirror held up to the 20th century, reflecting the immigrant struggle, the corruptibility of power, and the thin line between order and chaos. He was a builder of empires in a world where empires weren't supposed to exist. And like all great empire builders, his legacy is measured not in years lived, but in the reach of the shadow he left behind. Some shadows, after all, never fade. New York changes fast. Buildings go up, names fade from headlines, and the city swallows its past like it swallows everything else. But in certain corners, a dim bar in Little Italy, a cracked stoop on Mulberry Street, a backroom where the light is always low, the name Lucky Luciano still carries a kind of electricity. Old-timers tell it like a legend, how Charlie from the block made it bigger than anyone could have dreamed, how he walked the line between outlaw and statesman, and how he kept the peace in a world that respected neither law nor mercy. They talk about him not like a man who died decades ago, but like he might stroll in any minute, straightening his tie, smiling that half-smile that said you were either about to make a fortune or a mistake. The younger ones? They know him mostly through stories, or the Hollywood versions. Maybe they've never heard his voice, never seen him work a room, never felt that strange mix of danger and charm he carried. But they feel the ripple. They know the streets they walk were shaped in ways they can't see, by deals made long before they were born. In the quiet hours, the city feels almost like it did back then: rain on the pavement, subway grates breathing steam, the smell of roasted chestnuts and cigarette smoke hanging in the air. That's when the ghosts come out, the ones who never fully left. Luciano's is among them, not haunting in the usual way, but watching. Measuring. Making sure the rules still mean something. Maybe that's the truth about men like him, they don't really disappear. They become part of the city's bloodstream, part of the way it moves and thinks and remembers. The law may have exiled him. The newspapers may have written his final chapter. But the streets? The streets keep their own kind of history. And in that version, Lucky Luciano will always have a seat at the table. The commission wasn't just a council of criminals. It was a blueprint, a governing body for an underworld that, for decades, moved with more discipline and efficiency than some governments. And at the center of that blueprint was Lucky Luciano's vision: no single boss dictating to the rest, but a table where the most powerful families in America sat as equals, bound by rules that kept wars short and profits long. After Luciano's exile, the commission lived on. Its meetings became more secretive, its methods quieter, but its influence could still be felt from coast to coast. West Coast unions, Midwest rackets, Southern ports, all of it ran smoother when disputes were handled in-house and when nobody forgot the real purpose: making money. The FBI might have thought they'd cut off the head, but what Luciano built was too decentralized to die with one man. Historians debate whether this structure reduced violence or simply made it harder to detect. What's certain is that, for a long time, it kept the mob from tearing itself apart the way it had in the bloody years before 1931. When trouble came, a young boss getting too ambitious, a politician pushing too hard, the commission didn't hesitate to step in. And though Luciano's voice was gone from the room, his way of thinking still decided the outcome more often than not. Today, the commission's formal power is a shadow of what it was. RICO laws, wiretaps, informants, all of it chipped away at the walls Luciano built. But in the minds of those who study the mob, or in the whispers of the few old players left, the idea of the commission still holds weight. It's the reminder that once, organized crime in America wasn't just a scattered collection of crews, it was a syndicate, united under rules written by a man who knew the streets and the boardroom equally well. And maybe that's the truest measure of Luciano's genius, not just that he made money, or even that he kept power, but that he created something bigger than himself, something the law could attack, but never truly erase.